So today, we're going to dive into a pretty unique perspective, a philosophical lens that might help us make sense of, well, how reality takes shape, how it comes into being.
We're going to be looking at Herbert Witzenmann's Structure Phenomenology, Preconscious Formation of Reality.
And this is a big one, right? I mean, Witzenmann, he lived a long life, 1905 to 1988. And in that time, he developed this, well, this really unique approach to phenomenology.
Absolutely. And this is a first English edition of Structure Phenomenology, so it's really exciting to be able to bring his work to a wider audience, an audience that's already engaged in these crucial discussions about consciousness, especially first-person consciousness, in both philosophy and psychology.
Now, it's worth mentioning right off the bat that Witzenmann's writing, it can be a bit challenging. He uses a lot of neologisms, which makes sense given the new concepts he's trying to articulate. And then he's also very committed to scientific precision, so it's not light reading.
Right, and sometimes he even gets a little poetic, which can throw you off when you're expecting a very dry academic style.
But I think it's a worthwhile ride, because what Witzenmann is trying to do is nothing less than to understand the very nature of consciousness and how it relates to the way we experience and construct reality.
That's a pretty big goal. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good starting point is to look at Witzenmann's critique of what he calls representational consciousness. He basically argues that this dominant way of thinking about consciousness, it kind of gets in the way of us really experiencing reality directly.
Okay, so instead of seeing reality as it is, we're seeing a representation of it, like a map instead of the actual terrain.
And he contrasts this representational view with what's known as the sensory affection theory. This is an idea that comes from the natural sciences, and it basically says that our perceptions are just modifications that happen in our bodies in response to stimuli from the outside world.
So, like, if I see a tree, it's because the light from the tree is hitting my eyes and causing a reaction in my nervous system.
Right. But Witzenmann says that this theory doesn't really explain how we actually form concepts and ideas. And it also doesn't do justice to our capacity for actually engaging with reality in a meaningful way.
Okay, so he's saying there's more to it than just sensory input. There's something else going on that allows us to make sense of the world and to, I guess, to participate in it.
And that's where his concept of the basic structure comes in. This is really the core of structure phenomenology. It's the idea that every conscious experience involves a fundamental unification of perception and conception.
Perception and conception. So what I'm seeing and how I'm understanding it are always intertwined.
They're not separate things. They're two sides of the same coin. And Witzenmann says this is true for all conscious experience, no matter what we're experiencing or how we're experiencing it.
So can you give us an example of how this works?
Sure. Witzenmann uses the example of observing a lime tree.
Okay, a lime tree. I'm picturing it.
So when you look at that lime tree, you notice certain things about it. You see its shape, its color, the texture of its leaves. Those are all perceptual aspects.
Right, just what I'm seeing with my eyes.
Right. But then at the same time, you're also applying concepts to what you're seeing. You're recognizing it as a tree, as a lime tree specifically. You're noticing that it's taller than you, that it's standing upright. You might even be thinking about the limes that grow on it. All of those are conceptual aspects.
Right, so I'm not just seeing a bunch of green shapes. I'm understanding it as a tree with all of its associated qualities and characteristics.
And Witzenmann's point is that these two aspects, the perceptual and the conceptual, they're always working together to create our experience. We can't have one without the other.
Okay, so it's like the perception gives me the raw data, and the conception helps me to organize and interpret that data.
That's a good way to put it. And Witzenmann also points out that concepts have this interesting property he calls double universality. Well, let's take the concept of green as an example. When you see that lime tree, you see that its leaves are green. That's a particular shade of green. But the concept of green doesn't just apply to those specific leaves.
Right.
It also relates to a whole system of other color concepts, like lightness and darkness, hue and saturation.
Right, so green is both a specific color that I'm seeing and a general category that includes all kinds of different shades of green.
And Witzenmann says that this double universality is what allows us to connect our individual perceptions to a wider web of meaning.
So when I see the green leaves of the lime tree, I'm not just seeing a random color. I'm seeing something that fits into a whole system of colors and relationships.
Precisely. And this brings us to another important point that Witzenmann makes, the primacy of Gestalt formation. A Gestalt is basically a unified whole, a configuration of elements that is more than just the sum of its parts.
Okay, so like a melody is more than just a sequence of individual notes.
And Witzenmann says that this process of forming gestalts is fundamental to our experience. It's how we make sense of the world.
So how does this relate to the basic structure?
Well, Witzemann says that anything that contributes to this coherence-forming process, anything that has this universal quality, is a concept. And anything that's incoherent, that's not universal, is a percept.
Okay, I think I'm following. So the concepts provide the framework, the structure, and the percepts are the raw material that gets organized within that framework.
Right. And the really interesting thing is that these two aspects, the conceptual and the perceptual, they're not just working side by side. They're actually transforming each other. The universal conceptual dimension becomes individualized through its interaction with the non-universal perceptual dimension, and vice versa.
So the concept of tree gets particularized when I see the actual lime tree, and at the same time, my perception of the lime tree is enriched by my understanding of what a tree is.
And this leads Witzemann to a pretty radical conclusion. Reality is not something that's just out there waiting to be perceived. It's something that's constantly being formed and reformed in the very act of becoming aware.
So structure phenomenology, while it has roots in Husserl's work, identifies what it sees as certain limitations within his perspective. It acknowledges Brentano's significant contribution of introducing a first-person method in descriptive psychology, but suggests that Husserl's actual utilization of introspection remained, well, somewhat ambivalent. There's this sense that Husserl didn't fully embrace the potential of introspective inquiry. Structure phenomenology also takes issue with what it calls Husserl's idealistic aspirations. It suggests that Husserl's phenomenology leans too heavily on a priori concepts, on pre-existing categories of thought, rather than grounding itself in the direct observation of experience as it unfolds. And this is where structure phenomenology distinguishes itself, aligns itself more with what it calls the paradigmatic core of modern empirical science.
So it's rejecting these preconceived notions, emphasizing observation instead. Does that mean it aligns fully with a purely empirical approach?
Not quite. While it embraces the empirical spirit, the emphasis on observation, it also goes beyond traditional empiricism. You see, structure phenomenology argues that empirical inquiry shouldn't be limited to the external world, to the observation of physical phenomena. It advocates for a broadening of empirical investigation to include first-person research, the meticulous observation of the structure of our own intuition, our mental activity. It's kind of like extending the scientific method inward.
Fascinating. So it's not about rejecting empiricism, but rather expanding its scope. Is there an implicit critique of reductionist perspectives within science as well? I'm thinking of approaches that focus solely on breaking things down to their smallest parts.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. By emphasizing the pre-conscious formation of these holistic structures, these Gestalten structure phenomenology suggests that purely reductionist methodologies in science might be missing something crucial. They might be overlooking the emergent properties, the structural coherence that arises before things are even consciously articulated.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the ways structure phenomenology distinguishes itself from its predecessors. But we keep circling back to this idea of Gestaltbilden. Can we unpack this a bit more? It seems pretty central to everything we've been talking about.
It's the heart of the matter, really. Gestaltbilden refers to the preconscious formation of form. It's the process through which reality, as we experience it, is disclosed, revealed. Now, it's not a conscious act of construction. It's not like we're sitting here deliberately putting reality together. It's happening at a deeper level, a level beneath our conscious awareness.
So how does this process work? What's going on down there in the preconscious depths?
It's a dynamic interaction, a constant interplay between two sets of elements. On the one hand, you have these supertemporal principles of form, these universal structures that are kind of like the blueprints for reality. They exist outside of time, you could say. And on the other hand, you have these subtemporal elements, the raw data of our individual perceptions constantly flowing in, specific to each moment, each experience.
Okay, so we've got these universal blueprints, these timeless structures, and then we have this stream of individual experience.
Yeah.
How do they come together? How does the preconscious actually form something coherent out of all that?
That's where gestalt building comes in. This process takes those raw perceptions, those individual bits of experience, and shapes them, structures them in accordance with those universal principles. It's like those principles act as a sort of mold, guiding the formation of the structures we experience as reality. And what's fascinating is that this whole process is happening beneath the surface of our awareness. Our conscious experience, the reality we typically engage with, is actually a kind of after effect. It's what Spicker calls a deposited layer built upon this deeper preconscious structuring activity.
So our conscious reality is kind of like a finished product. In a way, it's the end result of this preconscious manufacturing process.
And that raises a really interesting question. If all this is happening preconsciously, how can we even access it? How can we study it? How do we even know it's there?
Right, it seems like a bit of a paradox. We're trying to understand something that's happening outside of our awareness. And this is where introspection comes in, right? You mentioned that earlier. But how can introspection, a process that seems so inherently subjective, personal, tell us anything about these universal structures, about this pre-conscious formation of reality?
It's a good question, and structure phenomenology offers a somewhat surprising answer. It places a huge emphasis on introspection, even more so than traditional phenomenology. But it's a particular kind of introspection, a rigorous, disciplined observation of our own mental processes, of the very act of experiencing. And the key here is that by focusing on the structure of our experience, on how things appear to us, on the process of perception itself, we can actually start to discern these underlying universal principles at work.
So it's not about the specific content of our thoughts and feelings, but rather about the form, the structure, the patterns of experience itself. Kind of like how a musician might focus on the structure of a melody, the intervals and rhythms, rather than the specific notes or instruments being played.
And what structure phenomenology argues is that while the specific content of our individual experiences might vary wildly, the underlying principles that govern how those experiences are structured, how they take shape, those are universal. They're operating in everyone, regardless of the particular content of their awareness.
So by looking inward, by carefully examining the structure of our own experience, we can gain insights into these universal principles that are shaping reality for everyone. It's almost like reverse engineering reality, starting from our own subjective experience and working backwards to uncover the underlying code.
That's a great analogy. And this leads us to another important concept in structure phenomenology, the idea of intentionality. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a twist here. Witzenmann, one of the key figures in this field, proposes an expanded conception of intentionality, one that goes beyond the traditional understanding.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. For those who might not be familiar with this term, can you remind us what intentionality means in the traditional sense?
In traditional phenomenology, intentionality refers to the directedness of consciousness. It's the idea that consciousness is always about something. It's always intending, pointing towards an object. So there's this subject-object structure, right? The subject, the conscious mind, directs its attention towards an object, something that is perceived as existing independently of the mind.
So I'm looking at a tree, for example. My consciousness, as the subject, is directed towards the tree, which is the object of my perception.
But Witzenmann argues that this traditional model is too limited. It doesn't fully capture the dynamic nature of consciousness, the way it actively participates in shaping the objects of experience. He proposes a more nuanced understanding, where intentionality isn't just this one-way street from subject to object. It's more like a dynamic interplay, a back and forth, where consciousness both shapes and is shaped by the objects it encounters.
So it's not just that I passively perceive the tree as something separate from me. My consciousness is somehow involved in its very formation as an object of my experience. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and it might seem a bit paradoxical. How can my consciousness be involved in shaping something that I perceive as external to me? It's like saying that the act of looking at a tree somehow contributes to the tree's existence. But that's precisely what structure phenomenology suggests. Remember those universal principles of form we talked about earlier? Well, Witzenmann argues that these principles are not just out there in some abstract realm. They're operating within consciousness itself. They're part of the very structure of how we experience the world.
So when I perceive that tree, it's not just my individual consciousness at work. It's those universal principles operating through my consciousness that are shaping my experience, giving form to the object I perceive as a tree.
Precisely. It's a co-creative process, a dynamic interplay between those universal structures and the raw data of perception. And this is where the idea of unfamiliarity comes in, the example we mentioned earlier. You know that feeling when you encounter something, an object, a situation, a person even, and you have this simultaneous sense of recognition and novelty. It's familiar in some way, but also strangely new.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that. It's like seeing something for the first time, but also feeling like you've always known it.
And Witzenmann suggests that this experience, this familiar unfamiliarity, is a key to understanding his expanded conception of intentionality. He argues that in these moments, the sensory and the conceptual, the immediate perception, and our pre-existing categories of thought, those are already merged. It's not like we first perceive the raw data and then try to make sense of it. The sense-making, the structuring is happening simultaneously with the perception itself.
So I'm not just seeing a collection of shapes and colors. I'm immediately experiencing it as a tree, as something that fits into my existing understanding of the world, but also has its own unique, unfamiliar qualities.
Right, and that's because those universal principles of form operating through our consciousness are already shaping our perception, integrating it into our conceptual framework. We're not passively receiving information from the world, we're actively co-creating it through this dynamic interplay of the universal and the individual.
This is really making me rethink my whole understanding of how perception works. And it ties back nicely to what we were discussing earlier about the interplay between those universal and individual elements in shaping our experience. We've got these universal principles, these timeless structures, and then we have the unique, fleeting data of our individual perceptions.
Yeah.
It's a constant dance between the two.
And it's this dance that gives rise to the reality we experience. It's not one or the other, it's the dynamic interaction between them. The universal provides the framework, the underlying structure, and the individual fills in the details, provides the specific content, and this interplay isn't just happening in perception, it's also at work in how we remember, how we construct our understanding of the past.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about memory. You mentioned earlier that structure phenomenology sees memory not as a passive storage of information, but as an active, constructive process. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the common metaphor for memory is like a filing cabinet, right? We store our experiences away, and then we retrieve them when needed. But structure phenomenology suggests that this is a pretty inaccurate model. It argues that remembering isn't about retrieving some pre-recorded event. It's about actively reconstructing the past. And this reconstruction is guided by those same universal and individual elements we've been talking about.
So when I remember something, I'm not just accessing a static file in my brain.
Not exactly. Instead, you're actively rebuilding the experience, drawing on both those universal principles of form and the specific details of your individual perception. It's like you're building a model of the past, using those blueprints of reality and the unique materials of your own experience.
So it's not just about recall, it's about reconstruction. And if memory is a constructive process, does that mean our memories are unreliable? Can we ever be sure that our memories are accurate reflections of the past?
That's a great question, and it's one that structure phenomenology grapples with directly. It acknowledges that the constructive nature of memory does raise questions about its objectivity, about the degree to which our memories correspond to some external objective reality. But it also offers a nuanced perspective on this issue. It introduces the concepts of passive disposition and active disposition. The passive disposition is kind of like the raw material of memory. It's the potential for remembering, a kind of latent trace of past experience. And this passive disposition is, in itself, universalizing. It's shaped by those same principles of form that govern all experience.
So even in the raw material of memory, those universal principles are already at work.
But it's through the active disposition, the actual act of remembering, of recollecting, that these general concepts, these universal structures, become individualized. They're brought into the specific context of the remembered experience. So when you remember something, you're not just passively recalling a pre-recorded event, you're actively constructing a new representation of that event, a representation that is shaped by both the universal and the individual.
So it's not a question of whether our memories are objectively true or false. It's more about understanding how they're constructed, how those universal and individual elements come together to shape our understanding of the past.
Right, and this understanding has implications for how we think about our belief in an objective reality. You know, that feeling that the world exists out there, independent of our minds. According to Witzenmann, this belief, the sense of objective presence, actually arises from that preconscious structuring activity we've been talking about. It's a consequence of that ongoing process of gestalt building, of shaping and forming reality according to those universal principles.
So our belief in an objective world isn't based on some direct apprehension of that world, but rather on the way our minds structure experience, according to these preconscious principles.
Precisely. And it's worth noting here that the text also introduces the concept of eternal presence. which it describes as the fundamental nature of our dim awareness of this basic structure. It's suggesting that there's this underlying dimension of consciousness, a kind of continuous flow, a duration from which our experience of discrete moments arises. And because of the nature of this self-giving basic structure, we can't just naively assume that our experience of presence, of remembering, is simply given. There's more to it than that.
So there's more going on beneath the surface, more to our experience of time and presence than we might initially realize.
And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the implications of all this for self-realization and freedom.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Hmm.
How does understanding this preconscious formation of reality, this interplay of universal and individual, how does that affect our understanding of who we are, of what it means to be human?
Well, structure phenomenology suggests that human existence finds its deeper meaning, its fulfillment, through self-realization. But this self-realization isn't about achieving some predetermined goal or conforming to some external ideal. It's about consciously participating in that very structure-forming process we've been talking about. It's about becoming aware of those subconscious, generative activities that are shaping our reality. And the text suggests that through practices akin to meditation, through cultivating an awareness of our own mental processes, we can foster what it calls a peaceable self-generation. It's about recognizing our own agency, our own role in shaping our experience, and through that recognition, experiencing a deeper sense of freedom.
Freedom from those preconscious patterns, those habitual ways of seeing and experiencing the world?
Yes, it's about becoming aware of those patterns, those structures, and then choosing how we engage with them. It's about recognizing that we're not just products of those structures, we're also producers. We're actively participating in their ongoing formation. And this brings us to the final point, the critique of materialism that's presented in the source material.
Right. We've talked a lot about how structure phenomenology challenges traditional philosophical approaches. But what about its relationship to the dominant scientific worldview, to materialism?
Well, structure phenomenology offers a pretty sharp critique of what it sees as the limitations of a purely materialistic perspective. It argues that materialism, in its attempt to reduce everything to matter and its interactions, can actually deny the human capacity for genuine reality and selfhood. It can lead to a kind of flattened, impoverished view of existence where we're just cogs in a mechanistic universe.
So it's not that structure phenomenology rejects the insights of science, but rather that it sees them as incomplete, as operating on a superficial level of reality.
Right. It suggests that there's more to reality than what can be captured by a purely materialistic framework. There's this deeper spiritual dimension that's often overlooked or dismissed in a purely scientific worldview.
And how does structure phenomenology account for this spiritual dimension?
It suggests that humans, through their conscious participation in that structure-forming process, actually contribute to a kind of spiritual coherence, a coherence that transcends both the subjective and the objective. It's not about imposing our will on the world, but rather about aligning ourselves with those universal principles, with that deeper spiritual flow of reality. And what's interesting is that the text even suggests that modern physics itself, with its assumption of a purely objective reality, might actually be operating on a superficial layer of reality.
So even physics, the most fundamental of sciences, might be missing a crucial piece of the puzzle.
That's the suggestion, yes. Structure phenomenology proposes that the entities that physics studies, those fundamental particles and forces, those are already structures, structures that have been preconsciously formed. And it suggests that by focusing solely on those structures, physics might be overlooking the deeper formative processes that give rise to them. It's like studying the bricks of a building without understanding the architecture, the underlying design that gives the building its form.
So to bring this all together, structure phenomenology is offering us a radical new way of understanding reality, one that challenges many of our basic assumptions about perception, memory, selfhood, and even the nature of the physical world.
Absolutely. It's a complex and challenging perspective, but I think it's one that has the potential to profoundly enrich our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And to wrap things up, I think it's worth reiterating the central thesis of structure phenomenology, as articulated in Spicker's work. Reality is not simply a given, something that exists independently of us. It's actively and preconsciously formed through a dynamic interplay between universal structures and our individual experiences.
And by understanding this process of preconscious formation, by grasping the role of those universal principles and the constructive nature of our perception and memory, we can gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of our own lives, our experiences, and our place in the universe.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a very thought-provoking question. If our conscious reality is, as this framework suggests, a deposited layer, a kind of after effect of this deeper generative structure, what other possibilities for understanding ourselves and the world around us might this perspective open up? What new avenues of inquiry, what new ways of being in the world might become available to us if we embrace this view of reality as preconsciously formed? It's a question worth pondering and one that we hope our listeners will continue to explore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.